Hi folks, HR Funk here with part 3 in my evaluation and tutorial of the Hilux Leatherwood M1000-Pro rifle scope. In this segment, I'm going to be taking a close-up look at the reticle used by the M1000-Pro, which in Hilux Leatherwood parlance is called the HR1. Now, back when I attended my original sniper training in the mid-1990s and throughout most of the time that I was an operational sniper, I used a scope with a simple USMC mil-dot reticle. And that was adequate for my purposes back in the day, and most snipers from that time used similar reticles in their rifle scopes. But since that time, technology has helped with the development of new optics and new reticles, and reticles like the HR1 inside the M1000-Pro are pretty standard today. And they do allow a lot of functionality that we didn't have back in the day. So with that little bit of an introduction, let's take a look at this HR1 reticle and find out what it can do. So here is the HR1 reticle as it appears when you look through the M1000 scope. And you can see that it consists of two different parts. There is the primary aiming and ranging axis here, and there's also the smaller ranging scale down in the lower right-hand quadrant of your field of view. You'll also notice, and it's difficult to see with the way I have this here, but the top portion of the field of view is left open so that it gives you or helps to maintain that very clear field of view, and you don't have that vertical axis going all the way to the top of the field of view. This was something I wasn't sure if I was going to like because it was different than the reticles that I'm used to, but the more I use this, the more I like it because it does give you slightly better vision without having all the various hash marks and axis lines and stadia and what have you cluttering up that top half of your field of view through the M1000. So unlike my older scope that I showed you at the beginning of the video, the HR1 reticle is graduated in minutes of angle, not mils. And this is something that I like because my brain calculates better in minutes of angle than it does in mils. And there's nothing wrong with using a mil-based reticle. I know a lot of people like those, but just personally, I prefer the minutes of angle because, again, that's how I think. I used a scope a few years ago in one of my competition rifles, and it had a mil-based reticle, and what I found myself doing was continually converting mils back to MOA to make my sight corrections with that scope. So when I have a reticle that's graduated in minutes of angle, it just makes it easier for me and other shooters whose mind also is programmed for minutes of angle. Similarly, the M1000-Pro is graduated in yards when you look at the magnification and ranging ring, and it's also zeroed at 200 yards, and this is a departure from the older M1000 scope. The M1000 was graduated in meters and also had to be zeroed at 250 meters, so this is another thing with the M1000-Pro that I personally appreciate because, again, it just lines up more with my way of thinking. The HR1 reticle also allows the shooter to perform several more functions than just simply aiming the rifle, as I mentioned a moment ago. Along with aiming, and the HR1 reticle is not unique in this regard, many different reticles allow these type of operations, but along with aiming the rifle, you can also use this type of reticle for range estimation, and I will show you how that's done. People typically think of range estimation with reticles that are graduated in mils, but it's also possible with a reticle like the HR1 that's graduated in minutes of angle. It just takes a slightly different formula to come up with your distance to the target. Along with that, this can be used for windage and elevation holds. And this is a nice thing because each one of these hash marks on the vertical and horizontal axis is really its own aiming point. So it allows for very precise holds, particularly for windage, if you need to use that rather than having to dial a sight correction into your windage and elevation turrets. This reticle also allows for moving target leads. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on moving target leads because that takes a lot of training and practice and experience, but it does have that function, so I at least wanted to mention it. And specific to the M1000-Pro, this allows the shooter to take advantage of the frame, aim, and shoot technique in order to properly take advantage of that auto ranging and trajectory function. So how does a reticle like the HR1 allow the shooter to perform all those different functions? It's because of something called subtension. And subtension is just a big word that means the distance of the hash marks in the reticle relative to the objects in the field of view in the scope. And based on the magnification of the scope and the size of the object that you're looking at through the scope, the reticle has very accurate measurements, and those can be used to perform all those various functions that I just mentioned. Now, something that I have to make you aware of with regard to the M1000-Pro, and I'll probably say this a couple of more times during this video. The M1000-Pro has the reticle in the second focal plane. That means the reticle stays the same size all the way through the range of magnification. It's the same size in your field of view at 2 power as it is in 10 power. Other scopes that have the reticle in the first focal plane or the front focal plane have reticles that get smaller and larger as the magnification is increased and decreased. Those scopes maintain the same relationship with the objects in the field of view all throughout the range of magnification for those scopes. Again, the M1000-Pro is not like that. With scopes that have their reticle located in the second focal plane, the scale on the reticle is only true at 1 power, and most of the times that power is the highest magnification setting for the scope. And that is the case with the M1000-Pro. At a magnification of 10, all of these will have the relative measurements that I'll mention here in a moment. So when the M1000-Pro is on 10 power, or a magnification setting of 10, the center crosshair is composed by intersecting lines that are each 2 minutes of angle long from end to end or top to bottom. That means from the very center of the cross, each arm extends 1 minute of angle in each direction. That's important because this area around that center cross is left open purposely in order to use that framing function that I'll talk about in a little bit. It's also important because you have to realize the second hash mark that you see going any direction on the horizontal or vertical axis is the 2 minute of angle mark. So if you need to go 2 minutes of angle in any direction, you need to go to what is actually the first hash mark beyond the center cross. After that, each hash mark that you see is 1 minute of angle in distance from the last. So going down, we've got 1 minute of angle to the end of that arm, and then 2, 3, 4, and 5. And at each 5 minute of angle increment, we have a 2 minute of angle line that's 2 minutes of angle long from top to bottom or side to side, just to give a quick visual reference to show that that is 5 minutes of angle along each scale. At the terminus of the windage axis, or the horizontal axis, there is a 4 minute of angle hash mark, and at the very top of the vertical axis and the very bottom of the vertical axis, there is also that same 4 minute of angle hash mark. So focusing for a moment on our vertical axis, you can see that there are 5 minutes of angle to be used for hold under of the target, and I'll talk about why that's important in a moment. And there are also 30 minutes of angle that can be used for hold over. Now, keep in mind, the M1000-Pro is going to autocorrect for bullet drop out to 1,000 yards. So out to 1,000 yards, you don't have to use holdover at all with this scope. Beyond 1,000 yards, you have 30 minutes of angle that you can use for additional elevation hold in order to fire at targets even farther away. With this additional 30 minutes of angle, This would give me, with my particular load, the ability to engage targets out to about 1,350 yards, just by using the holdover along with that bullet drop compensation that I get from the auto ranging and trajectory function. Now a shooter could get an additional 5 minutes of angle of holdover if, instead of using the center cross for the 0 point on the scope, that shooter used this terminus at the top of the vertical axis. Again, considering that this is going to get you well out beyond 1,000 yards, I don't know how many shooters are going to need to or want to do that, but that would be another option. The more important function of this vertical axis above the center crosshairs is to give the shooter the ability for hold under. Now, going back to the idea that the M1000-Pro is zeroed at a distance of 200 yards, with my load, if I'm shooting at 100 yards, that's almost exactly 2 minutes of angle high in terms of my bullet's point of impact at that distance of 100 yards. So if I'm shooting at 100 yards, I would actually use the 2 minute of angle hash mark right here as my aiming point, and I wouldn't have to change anything else with regard to the scope or the elevation setting on the elevation turret or anything else. I would just simply use this aiming point for 100 yards and fire off my shot. At 200 yards, I'm here. If I was firing it at 150 yards, I would probably use the very tip of this arm extending up from the center cross. Looking now at the horizontal axis, this is the scale that you're going to use for wind holds. And another nice thing about that auto ranging and trajectory function is if you're in auto ranging mode, you're always going to be using the center crosshair for your aiming point, meaning that if you need to use a wind hold, it's always going to be along the horizontal scale. So you won't be holding out here in space somewhere as you would if you're using a different type of scope or a different type of reticle that didn't have that auto ranging function. So if we need to hold for wind, we have 10 minutes of angle going either way that we can do that. And another nice thing is between the axis terminus here and the tip of this point, and there's also another tip down here at the bottom. You can just barely see it right here. That's an additional 2 minutes of angle. So that would get you up to 12 minutes of angle of windage hold going either direction. And I believe for my rifle, in order to require 12 minutes of angle of windage at 500 yards would require a 30 mile per hour full value crosswind. So it would take a pretty strong wind in order for me to finally resort to clicking windage into my windage turret in order to make a sight correction for that wind. And here is an overlay of the HR1 reticle with all of the various measurements for everything you see as you look at the HR1 through the M1000-Pro scope. We also see the measurements over here for the ranging scale, and I'll talk about the ranging scale in a little bit and give you a better idea of exactly what this is here for. Now I'll repeat what I said a few minutes ago as you're looking at this. The values that you see reflected by these measurements are only accurate when the scope is set at a magnification power of 10. Anything other than that is going to change these measurements. But at 10 power, these are the measurements of all the various features of the HR1 reticle. At this point, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the HR1 reticle and other reticles similar to this perform the various functions that they allow for the shooters. To begin with, I'll talk about range estimation. And this is probably one of the more common things that these type of reticles are used for. In order to determine range with a reticle such as the HR1, the first thing you need to know is the size of the object you're looking at, or the size of an object close to the object that you're looking at, or an object close to your target. When I was still an operational sniper, I used to have measurements of a lot of common objects recorded in my rifle's logbook, just in case I needed to take range from, say, a street sign or the wheel of a police car or something like that, traffic cone, anything like that. I already had the dimensions of that object recorded. Then all I had to do was plug them into the formula in order to determine range. If you are trying to determine range with the HR1 reticle, the first thing I'll tell you is make sure your magnification is set to a power of 10. Then you have to take the size of the object that you're ranging with the reticle, and you need to know that object's size in inches. In order to determine the range to that object, you take the size in inches times 95.5, which is a standard. So size in inches times 95.5 divided by how many minutes of angle that object measures in your reticle. So if we have a 10-inch item times 95.5, that would be 955, divided by, say, 2 minutes of angle, that's going to give us a range of 477.5 yards. So that's a very simple indication of how you would use this type of a reticle in order to determine distance to your target. Once again, that formula is the size of the object that you're looking at in inches times 95.5 divided by the number of minutes of angle as measured in the HR1 reticle. Again, that's only true if the scope is set to a magnification power of 10. Also, as I mentioned, bullet drop compensation or holdover is possible with this type of a reticle. The first thing you need to know is the trajectory of your bullet and its drop at a given distance, and you need to know what the distance is to your target so you can determine that bullet drop. But so long as you know that drop in minutes of angle, you would simply hold on the appropriate hash mark that corresponds with that number of minutes of angle of drop of the bullet. Use that as your aiming point and fire your shot. Very quick, very simple. And something that, considering this has the auto ranging function in the M1000-Pro, you're probably not going to need to do too often, but if you would need to perform that function, that's the way it's done. Wind holds, on the other hand, are going to be far more common. And the first thing you need to determine is the amount of bullet deflection the wind is going to cause with your bullet at a given distance. Once that's determined and you've made your proper wind call, and keep in mind you have to take into consideration both wind velocity and direction in order to make your proper wind call, you would then need to convert that to minutes of angle, either using a ballistic app or a ballistic wind chart, so that you know how many minutes of angle of deflection you're going to get at that given distance. And then once again, you could use the appropriate hash mark to hold off for that wind value. Now, as I've said several times, this is only going to be accurate in terms of minutes of angle at a magnification power of 10 in the M1000-Pro. So let's say we're shooting at a distance other than 1,000 yards or using a magnification other than 10, particularly in auto ranging and trajectory mode, where you would be dialing the magnification power in order to properly frame the target and then squeezing off your shot based on whatever power you were set to that corresponded with the auto range trajectory mode. How do we determine what the wind hold is going to be if we're firing with the scope on something other than 10 power? The best way that I've found to do that is to convert whatever magnification setting you're using to a decimal of 10. For example, 500 yards would be a 5 power magnification on the M1000-Pro, and 5 power is 0.5 of 10 power. Similarly, if you're on 2 power at the 200 yard setting, 2 power would be a decimal of 0.2 as compared to 10 power. So once you determine the proper wind hold in minutes of angle for whatever the velocity and direction of the wind is at the target that you're shooting, the next thing you would do is take whatever that minute of angle value you determine to be times the decimal for the magnification setting you're using. So if we're shooting at 500 yards and we have a 10 mile an hour full value crosswind, that would require a windage hold of 4 minutes of angle. Actually, just slightly less than that. I believe it's 3.94 minutes of angle, but I would use 0.4, or excuse me, I would use 4 minutes of angle. And if we were on 10 power, I would use the 4th hash mark, again, holding it into the wind, as my aiming point and squeeze off the shot. If, however, I'm on 5 power, again, 5 being a decimal of 0.5 as compared to the magnification power of 10, then I would take my 4 minute of angle correction times 0.5, and the answer that I get is no longer going to be in minutes of angle, but it's going to tell me which hash mark to use. So my 4 minute of angle correction times 0.5 at 500 yards on a magnification setting of 4 times 0.5 would be 2, which tells me to hold on the second hash mark. Again, keep in mind this arm would normally represent 1 minute of angle, but there's no hash mark there. So this is 2 minutes of angle. And at 500 yards on a magnification setting of 5, I would be using this hash mark for my wind hold. If I was on 2 power and I had that same 4 minute of angle correction that was required, I would take 4 times 0.2, which is 0.8, and if there was a hash mark right here, that would be 1. I would hold just shy of the end of that line into the wind and use that as my aiming point. So once again, the easiest way that I found to calculate this is to convert whatever magnification you're using to a decimal of 10 power and take your minute of angle correction times that decimal to tell you which hash mark to hold on for your windage correction. And lastly, I mentioned moving target leads, and as I said before, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with moving target leads. In order to determine your proper lead, you need to take into account the speed and direction of your target. You also need to take into consideration the distance to that target so you can calculate the bullet's time of flight, and you need to calculate all of your other environmental factors like wind and temperature and altitude and all that. And normally by the time you complete all those calculations, whatever moving target you wanted to shoot at has moved to somewhere you can't shoot at it anymore. So typically, moving target leads becomes almost a feel, and it's something, again, that a shooter develops after much, much training and practice. I have hit moving targets. I've done it more than once, but I also cannot sit here and tell you that I could make all of those shots again that I've made in the past. Again, moving target leads are very difficult, and they require a great deal of skill and a great deal of training. Okay, now let's talk about using the HR1 reticle specifically in the M1000-Pro scope and some of the things that that scope allows with regard to this reticle. First, if we're shooting at a known distance, that makes it very easy because you can simply dial that magnification and range ring to the proper distance. If you have time and you wish to, you can uncouple the magnification ring from the trajectory cam at that point and dial up the reticle to full power if you want to do so. But regardless of how you do it, once you set it to the proper distance, all you have to do is aim and fire off your shot. So very easy, very simple. And I've had a couple of people make comments on some of the past videos that I've made with regard to the M1000-Pro, talking about how they think that it's a very complicated system and it takes a lot to set it up. Maybe it does take a little bit of time to set up and a little bit of thought to understand, but once it's set, it becomes a very simple system. And again, if you're shooting at a known distance, you basically turn the dial to the proper distance, aim, and fire off a shot. Very, very simple at known distance. Now let's talk about the process to frame, aim, and then shoot your target. In order to properly frame your target, you're going to be using the center crosshair and the tips of the axis stadia that you see here. There are two known distances, and again, you have to know the approximate size of your target in inches in order to properly do this. From the center crosshair to the tip of any of the stadia lines in either the horizontal or the vertical axis should or is intended to properly frame 18 inches of distance. From the tip of one axis to the tip of another is intended to frame a distance of 36 inches. Again, you have to know the size of your target, but if you properly frame the object in that area that conforms to those distances, that allows the scope to properly set itself for the bullet drop at whatever distance that target is located. And I'm going to switch to another frame here in a moment to show you a little bit better how these measurements are taken, and then we'll also look at a couple of proper framings for intended targets. And here we see a slightly larger view, and you can see from the tip of one axis to this tip of the other is intended to frame a distance of 36 inches. And again, from the center axis to the tip of either stadia line is intended to form, or measure rather, a distance of 18 inches. And here we see the same exact thing reflected just the opposite way. And here we see how we would properly frame our target for a known distance of 18 inches. Here our buck measures 18 inches from the top of his shoulder to the bottom of his chest. You can see that that distance is properly framed in the target here. At this point, the only thing the shooter would have to do is bring the point of aim back to the proper place and squeeze off the shot. And here we see the proper framing for 36 inches, and this is with the horizontal axis. You can see it goes from the tip of our coyote's nose to his rear, right at the base of his tail, and that gives us the proper framing there. Again, the only thing this shooter would have to do at this point is essentially squeeze the trigger properly. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about is our ranging scale down here in the lower right-hand quadrant of our field of view. And here's a blown up look at that ranging reticle, and you can see that it is graduated in multiples of 9 inches. And this is intended to be used exactly the same way as the center reticle for frame, aim, and shoot, only instead of being restricted to just 18 inches or 36 inches, this gives you a lot of other options. And you can see again that it's graduated in steps of 9 inches. And on the vertical axis, it gives you the ability to scale all the way up to 72 inches. And we again have 36 inches in the horizontal axis. The nice thing about this reticle also is it gives you the ability to extrapolate a little bit if you have targets that are not exactly 18 inches or 36 inches. If you have, for example, a target that is 12 inches, we know that 12 is 2/3 of 18. So if I was holding on the 18-inch line here, I would hold it to where it was about 2/3 of the way to the center axis, or the horizontal axis rather, and that would give me a pretty good distance and a pretty good framing to that 12-inch target. Same thing with any other targets that are some measurement other than the standard 36 or 18, or if it's not exactly 9 inches, it would still give you the ability to pretty accurately range those objects out to whatever distance you're shooting. And again, here's our coyote being properly framed using the ranging reticle, or the ranging scale rather. And once again, here is our buck properly framed using the ranging reticle. Now, obviously, once this range was taken and the auto trajectory cam was set, the shooter would have to go back to the primary reticle, the primary crosshairs, in order to make this shot. You could not take the shot in this orientation. And that's going to do it for my attempt at disambiguation of the HR1 reticle as used in the M1000-Pro rifle scope. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, as always, make sure you forward those to me. Remember, if you order anything from Optics Planet, be sure to use my discount code, which is... And if you use that discount code, it's good for 5% off anything you purchase from Optics Planet. See you next time, folks. And until then, good shooting. Bye-bye.